You've heard of Skinwalker Ranch, right? A mysterious and terrifying place in Utah where unexplained and creepy things happen. Well, it's not just Skinwalker Ranch that is haunted by the unknown. Today I'll show you with these allegedly true, scary stories that many other ranches contain terrifying creatures, things, and experiences. Now let's begin. I lived in a comfy little town in northern Texas, where as you drive along those winding roads, you would see gates with titling that would read such and such ranch. Basically, it seemed like everything other than some retail buildings was ranch land. Lots of cows, horses, and crops. It's nice if you like the scenery, but if you prefer having things to do, it's not the greatest. I mean, even if you like going camping or hiking, you'd have to drive quite a ways before hitting property that ain't private land. At the time, I worked as a pizza delivery driver. It wasn't a hard job, but dang was it stressful. Delivery just wasn't that profitable when each delivery destination was several miles apart. Driving so much every night really gets to you. In the future, I would come to realize that other delivery places in different towns had mileage restrictions far smaller than what we had at that little pizza place. No joke, I would often drive 15 miles between destinations. Though now I know national chains like Domino's restrict their delivery to 5 or 6 miles or so depending on drive time. Even with the roads having higher speed limits out in that area because of the wide country roads, it would often take me 20 minutes to get to someone's residence. I guess the good news was most folks in that area understood that ordering a pizza meant that the food wouldn't be hot and fresh out of the oven by then. Everyone was still friendly. Seriously, I don't remember a single order that wasn't positive or neutral with the customer. Regarding customers, I never had any holdups, complaints, or arguments. Nothing. Folks were just kind. In the summer, I'd have customers offer me bottled or canned drinks before heading back out. Sorry for the long setup. This brings me to my extremely creepy experience I had delivering to a certain ranch I will not name. I'd rather not dox a friendly customer's residence just because something happened on their land. We got a call for 2 large pizzas, both Canadian bacon, my personal favorite. We prepared them, I jumped in my car, checked my gas, and headed out on my way. Always want to double-check your gas before and after deliveries. The address was to a ranch 14 miles from the restaurant. Luckily, much of the road there had a speed limit of 70 miles per hour, so I could probably get there with the pizza still hot enough. It was 7:30 p.m. and completely dark by then. There was thunder and lightning on occasion with clouds covering the entirety of the night sky, so between flashes of lightning, it was nearly pitch black out. I got onto the highway and turned on my high beams. There was no oncoming traffic the whole way, so my high beams would be fine. They were practically a necessity with how often deer would run out onto the road. Several minutes later, I turned right onto a dirt road. This road seemed to get thinner the further I drove along, to the point I was starting to drive extremely cautiously to avoid low-hanging branches and outreaching plants that threatened to scratch my car. I had no idea how close I was to the residence then, or how long this dirt road would go on for. I was so focused on avoiding obstacles that I nearly screamed when I saw something run across the road. It scared the bejesus out of me, to be quite honest. I saw flashes of fur and immediately thought, freaking deer. I breathed in deep and let my heart settle for a second before continuing on the drive. The moment I stepped on the gas again, though, I heard something slap into the right side of my car. Again, I was terribly startled. I slammed the brake as before and looked over to the passenger side. It was so dark out there, I couldn't see anything outside unless it was being hit by my headlights. I couldn't even see the bushes and tree branches that were nearly close enough to my car to scrape the windows. Seriously? I wondered. What was that? A bird? Did a bird just fly into my car? I was determined to finish this delivery so I could get out of this place as fast as possible. After all, when 2 weird things happen back to back, a person quickly goes from focused or even bored to on edge. I eased off the brake, still scanning the surroundings on both sides of me. I began to push down slightly on the accelerator. Finally, I'm moving again, and for a few moments everything seemed normal. Then slap, 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 something repeatedly. and in quick succession slaps my window, the driver window, 3 times. I swear to God, I hit the brakes and heard someone running into the trees while laughing. I was sure of it then that someone was out here messing with me, which possibly meant that someone ordered these pizzas just to make me the victim of their immature pranks. Too frightened to get out of the car, I rolled the window down a slight bit, leaning my face forward, then shouting, "Knock it off! It ain't freaking funny!" Then I rolled the window back up. The moment the glass hit the top of the door, signaling that it was back in place, I heard something that sent chills down my spine. Keep in mind, I keep my doors locked as I drive. I always have, always did, always will. And yet somehow the back passenger door had opened. Immediately, I heard someone hurriedly scoot across the seat to the other side so that they would sit in the seat directly behind mine. I even heard them giggle behind me. There was an undertone to their voice, like their vocal cords were all messed up or damaged, maybe from years of smoking or something. My mind conjured images of a druggie rather than kids messing with me on this dark dirt road. Have you ever been so scared that you're too afraid to look in the direction of what's scaring you? That's exactly how I felt. Someone was in my car with me. Heck, the back passenger door was still open. I could not only hear, but also feel someone's breath behind me. Yet, for a moment, I stayed motionless. Eventually, I resolved to turn all at once. I counted down in my head, 3, 2, 1. I turned so fast I felt the muscles and bones in my neck ache in disagreement. My fist was raised, ready to defend myself as I looked into the back seats. They were empty. But the back passenger door still hung open. Horrified, I swallowed hard and rapidly crawled over through the middle of the car, yanked the door shut, then sat back down in the driver's seat, clicking the lock button repeatedly on the door to lock all the doors in the car. But as I said before, they had already been locked. I knew I'd felt someone else in that car with me. I was certain of it. I couldn't just turn away from them again to keep driving. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to check the trunk. The back seats of my car had levers with which you could access the trunk from the interior of the car. My paranoia grew, telling me that this interloper was still here, but they were now hiding in the trunk. Trembling, I crawled over the middle again and lowered one of the seats. I peered into the trunk. It was dark, but I had just enough visibility from the ceiling light that I could tell that there was no one there. I crawled over the middle again, sitting down in the driver's seat and breathing slowly. My eyes were watery with terror, like I was passively crying from feeling so shaken up. Tap, tap. This time I didn't hesitate. Instinctively, I turned toward the tapping sound which had come from the driver window just now next to me. Someone was pressing their face into the glass from outside. They were there only an extremely brief moment before they took off giggling. I saw them. I swear to God, their entire face was covered in hair, gray hair, and their eyes had been solid black. From what I could see, there wasn't an inch of bare skin on them at all. For the quarter of a second that I saw them, they didn't look completely human. I know it makes me sound crazy, but I saw what I saw. They, or it, took off into the woods so fast they were lost in the dark before I could see much else. By then, I was flooring it through the dirt road. I'd never felt so horrified in my life, let alone confused. About 2 minutes later, I broke through the tree line. Suddenly, I hit the brakes as fast as I could, barely avoiding hitting a gate. I could see a 2-story home about half a football field away beyond the gate. The lights were on, the gate was closed. Behind me were those darned woods. I would need to get out to lift the latch on the gate to drive through. Screw that. I'm sorry if it sounds bad on my part, but I blared my car horn over and over and over until I saw someone at the house open the door and begin to walk my way. The last thing on earth I wanted to do in that moment was get out of my car, not with the woods so close behind me. A man who appeared to be in his 50s came out with a rifle and a flashlight. He opened the gate and walked over to my window. I lowered it. Jesus, boy, you scared the daylights out of me. Everything all right? Yes, sir. I just had some trouble getting up here is all. His eyebrow raised at me. You're the pizza guy. Go on ahead and drive through. I'll close the gate after you, if you don't mind giving me a lift back to the house. Sure thing, was all I could mutter. though I wasn't sure I was supposed to have any non-employees in my car while on the clock. At the moment, I didn't care. Well, the man did just that. I pulled through, he closed the gate, and then he sat in the passenger seat after I placed the pizzas in the back. "You look real shaken up there. You sure you're okay?" he insisted. "I'll be completely honest with you, sir. I was driving on the road up here where the road's real narrow and all. Then someone started running around my car, hitting it and giving me a pretty bad scare." I explained. "Christ, I'm so sorry." He apologized. I glanced at him and he looked genuinely sad. "I thought it was over." "What? What do you mean?" "It's nothing to worry about. Just some trouble we've been having around here." The man stepped out after I parked. We were in his driveway now. I grabbed the pizzas and walked with him to the door. He opened it, took the pizzas, then said, "One sec." He closed the door. Even though there were porch lights on around me, keeping the darkness at bay, I couldn't help but feel watched by the forest in the distance just beyond the gate. The door opened again, and I nearly jumped. The man stood there still looking as if he had something to feel guilty about. He still had his rifle too, but he stretched out his hand to me. "Here, take this for your troubles." I kid you not, this man handed me $500. "Sir, that's too much." "I can't, I insist. Take it. Get back in your car and follow me out into those fields. There's a separate entrance over there. Might take you longer to get back, but it's safe." "I know it's safe." "Okay then, thank you so much," I said. I got back in the car. The older man walked around the house and beckoned me with his free hand. I steadily drove over the grass. His backyard was a well-kept field of grass, with a couple of different shed-looking buildings on either side. In the distance there was another gate, but the closer we got to it, the more I realized it was far less maintained than the other. This entrance really was seldom used. I remember thinking, why didn't he just get back in the car with me and show me where to go? The poor guy was walking another 2/3 of a football field in the dark to show me how to leave. I got to the gate. He opened it, then walked over to my window, gesturing for me to lower it. Now this road is much more wide, and the forest ends much sooner, but you'll be on an old logging road that takes a few minutes to get back to the highway. Just go left when the woods ends and you're all set. Thank you again. I'm sorry if the pizzas are all cold by now. I didn't mean to take so long getting here." He shook his head and waved his hand at me. No, don't worry about that. I'm sorry for the trouble. We won't be ordering no delivery for a while, not till we get this taken care of." Then the man walked away to the gate. I pulled through and kept driving as he shut the gate behind me. I did get a little spooked being back in the woods again, but he was right. A few seconds of a forest drive, and there I was on a one-lane road. 10 minutes later, I was back on the highway, and the ordeal was over. I was able to head back to the restaurant. I couldn't help but wonder if they were having trouble with the front entrance. Why was the back seldom used? What was going on there? I can't honestly tell you much else. I never did get a call to go back to that ranch. None of my coworkers did either. Believe me, I asked around. In fact, none of them had ever gotten a call from that ranch in the past. I figure that meant the folks living there only made that one call, then stopped calling for deliveries once again. This problem they had that the man did not explain, it seems they'd been having it for a while. And for the next few years I worked at that pizza place, and none of us ever did get a call from that ranch. So maybe they never got that problem taken care of. I don't know what's going on in those woods, but I pray that family's all right. I've since moved to Missouri. I work in delivery still, but the drives are far more manageable. To all my friends out there who deliver, stay safe and try to bring some sort of protection. It could be worth it. Remember to keep your gas tanks filled, because if I'd been stranded in those woods with that thing, I don't know what would have happened. One morning, my mom took my oldest brother to the heart doctor for his yearly checkup. My youngest brother was at the babysitter's house, who lived in a house behind us. My dad was across the street at the camp house for breakfast, and I was home waiting on the school bus. At the time, we lived close to the main ranch house. It was a bright, sunny morning, and this was my first day at a new school, first grade. We just moved here, and it was my dad's first day as a ranch hand, so he was anxious to leave early, so I was left at home eating my cereal for breakfast. I wasn't done eating my breakfast when I hear our dog, Baby, barking. She was a ridgeback and a very protective dog. She hardly left us alone for very long if we were playing outside. Anyway, she started barking and I went outside thinking it was the bus picking me up, but I didn't see anyone around. The bus wasn't there. Baby began barking and her hair was standing on end. She kept running back and forth, basically telling me not to move. I looked around to see if I could find my dad. I turned to look behind the house and didn't see the babysitter out or anything. I couldn't find anyone else out and about. Then Baby started growling. She was literally up close to my leg, growling loudly. I looked towards where she was looking, and I noticed the only palm tree in the middle of the courtyard. This courtyard separated our home, and it acted as the driveway to the camp house and the sitter's house, but it could also lead out towards other parts of the ranch from the main house. It kind of looked like a roundabout. In the middle of this roundabout was a palm tree on a patch of grass. I noticed a woman dressed in a sky blue nightgown. She had long black hair, wore makeup, and long red fingernails. She came out of the top of the palm tree. She came out torso first, then all of her was just out floating in the air. Her hair was blowing around her and she began to tell me to come to her using her finger. I shook my head no. She kept using her finger telling me to come towards her. I looked around again and still did not see anyone. So I ran back into the house and hid under the kitchen table. I just hugged my legs, crying. Then I heard and saw all the curtains fall off the windows. I thought she was in the house. I thought she was going to get me. Then I ran outside and thankfully the bus was there. Later that day when I came home from school, I was a little brave, so I walked up to the palm tree to see if maybe there was a split in it. 8-year-old me was just trying to figure out how this woman could have come out of the palm tree like that. If you know anything about southern Texas, you know there are stickers in the grass. I remember she was barefoot and I was wondering how she even got here with no shoes on. I still think of this day because she seemed so real to me. Who was she? This happened in 2019. In March of that year, I had moved out of my parents' house, and after that, my entire life came crashing down. The worst thing that happened wasn't that my boyfriend broke up with me and left me to live alone. It wasn't losing 2 family members or my best friend. It wasn't getting diagnosed with cancer. The worst thing that happened was finding something horrible in the woods and the consequences that were brought with it. I've always been the type who isn't afraid of much. I work on a ranch, so I've seen a lot of death. Whenever a horse on the ranch died, we would bury it in the pasture. We'd always bury it deep enough that no wild animals could get to the horse. So it was strange to say the least when some of the horses were beginning to get dug up and taken. No one at the ranch knew how someone got that kind of equipment past the security cameras to dig the horses up and transport them. It wasn't until weeks after when my boss and I figured out that someone didn't take the horses. My boss and I were out fixing fences in the late afternoon. It was very cold and starting to get dark. We finally got to where there was a hole in the fence and noticed blood on the barbed wire along with the trail leading into the woods. We both figured a horse had caught itself on the barbed wire and ran off. That was a reasonable assumption since it had happened before. So we quickly fixed the fence and hopped on the quad to go grab some rope, horses, and flashlights. We grabbed 2 fast and fantastically trained horses and headed out to where we saw the blood trail. My boss had her 9mm pistol and a lasso, while I had a 12-gauge shotgun and a large hunting knife. We followed the trail of blood. It led to a horse that was extremely scared. We roped the horse and brought him back to the barn. As I was walking to my truck, I realized that I had dropped my knife. In the morning, I would go back to find my knife. The next morning, I went back out to where we found the horse. This time, it was bright out and I could see my surroundings. What I found was terrifying. There were multiple horse carcasses all around. Each of them had their faces ripped off, but nothing else had been eaten. I also found a single boot, a woman's boot. I never found my knife, but I didn't care. I left that place. The weeks after I found those remains were incredibly strange. It started with my truck. I locked it every night, but every morning it would be unlocked. Then I found the glove compartment opened a few days later. Some mornings I would find everything from my center compartment laid out neatly on my seats. Other days I would find things in my house moved from where I put them. After a shower, the word no would be written in my mirror. I was starting to get spooked, knowing someone or something was in my home. 2 weeks after I found the horses, I went to take a shower and there was a bite taken out of my bar of soap. What kind of psychopath does that? It wasn't until a few weeks later that I began to put some of the pieces together. One morning I woke up and in my living room was the skull of a dead horse. I realized all these creepy things happening to me had to have been because I found all those dead horses. I don't know who or what got inside my house or how it got inside. I just hope it leaves me alone. I'm a 20-year-old male and I own a 350-acre ranch in southern Colorado, bordered by BLM land or Bureau of Land Management land. So there's nothing around us for easily 20 miles, which is where this story takes place. Growing up, I was always on a ranch or farm, so I'm no stranger to the trade, and I'm not easily surprised. Heck, I've even seen everything from a coyote walking upright on its hind legs to crackheads trying to pet my cattle. Anyway, this particular story is permanently etched into my mind. It was the spring of 2020. I'd just gotten married and was sharing my ranch with my wife, my best friend who for privacy reasons we'll call Art, and his girlfriend. It was around 11 and I was in bed reading. My wife was sound asleep next to me when I heard a bunch of our cattle wailing like something was scaring them or hurting them. I jumped out of bed and grabbed my 12 gauge and .45 revolver. I ran into the living room where I met Art. He asked me if I heard the cattle. I said yeah and said it was probably coyotes messing with the herd, a common occurrence around here, especially during calving season, so I told him I would handle it. I got my boots on and headed out to my old Ford pickup. It didn't take me long to find the herd because in this heat, even at night, they stay close to the watering trough. As I was pulling up, I saw something moving between my truck and the cattle, something scuttling through the grass. I shrugged it off as a straggler coyote. I shut my truck off, but I left the lights on. As soon as I opened the door, I smelled it, something like rotten eggs. It was almost overwhelming. However, I figured being in a field of cattle, maybe some of their feces had started baking in the sun. It wasn't until I started walking towards the stock tank that I realized something was very wrong. My stock tank is roughly 12 feet in diameter and about 2 feet deep. I have to refill it about twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, so I definitely would have noticed if something was amiss. The water was stained red with blood and had what looked to be entrails floating in it. But before I could investigate further, something stepped in front of my headlights. Even with my back to the truck, I could see the light temporarily cutting out. By this time, I was pretty on edge. I pulled my shotgun off of my shoulder and slowly turned around, trying to tell myself it was just a curious calf that was standing in front of my truck. I couldn't have been more wrong. What I saw when I turned around stood about 7 or 8 feet tall and was much closer than I thought. It was so close that if I wasn't frozen in fear, I could have poked it with the barrel of my gun. This thing's skin was tan and pulled tightly over its muscular complexion. Its arms hung by its side, allowing its freakishly long fingers to almost touch the ground. Its legs were all wrong, backwards bending like a dog's hind legs. I followed its body to its head, something that looked impossibly large. It had no ears I could see, and its nose was nothing more than a couple of slits in its face. But the eyes, they were dead, lifeless like a shark's, and a mouth full of jagged teeth. We stood there, that thing and I, for what felt like an eternity. It the hunter and me the prey, before it took one step towards me. All the while the rotting egg smell grew stronger. I simply couldn't will myself to move. It looked down at me before I was knocked to the ground, but the strangest thing was it didn't push me. It was almost like the earth behind me reached up and pulled me to the ground. The last thing I remember before I blacked out was that thing standing over me, one leg on either side of my body. I woke up shortly after with Art and my wife standing over me. It was still dark out, so I had no clue how long I'd been out for. They took me back to the house and asked me what happened. Reluctantly, I told them. I have no doubt they didn't believe me because they told me to sleep it off. I wish this was where the story ended, but the next night, just before sundown, Art and I were sitting on the back porch when all of a sudden Art grabbed my arm and said, "Did you see that?" I looked over to where he was pointing, and at first I didn't see anything. But then I saw it. Off in the distance, I could see something running, seemingly on all fours along our fence line, occasionally stopping to poke its head up and look around. "Get the guns and get in the truck," Art said. We gathered up as much firepower as we thought was necessary before hopping in my Ford. By then it was getting dark, so I turned the headlights on as we drove along the trail that ran the length of the fence until we made it to where we had last seen that thing. What should we do? I asked Art, but no sooner had he started to open his mouth when we felt something big jump into the bed of the truck. Art and I both dove onto the floor. On my truck, I have a headache rack with a light on it to illuminate the bed. Slowly, I reached up and turned it on. The instant the light turned on, we saw that thing, the same one I'd seen the night before, peering through the back window. We were trapped. If we tried to run, that thing would be on us in an instant. If we stayed in the truck, I have no doubt it could have punched through the glass. But it just kept looking at us before it choked out the words in a voice that sounded like 5 people saying the same thing at once. "You are trespassers, our band. We were here long before you, and will be long after you." With that, it leapt out of my truck and scuttled off on all fours into the night. Art and I both lay on the floor for a couple of minutes before we got the courage to get up and look around. When we saw nothing, we didn't hesitate to hightail it back to the house. To this day, I haven't seen this creature again. And if there's something out there that needs a calf every so often to leave me and my family alone, I'm not going to complain. There are things out here in the great, empty spaces of the prairie that have been here long before us and will be long after we die. I remembered this story when I was driving home late the other night, and just thinking about it really creeped me out. This didn't happen to me, but I did hear it from my ex-girlfriend's grandma years ago, about a friend of hers. We'll call her Grandma Z. Z worked as a therapeutic masseuse at a spa in a nice little town in northwest Arkansas. To give you a bit of an idea of what kind of person Z was, she lived in a little stone cottage with a shrine to a Hindu holy man as its centerpiece, and she carried pipe tobacco in her Volvo to sprinkle on roadkill. Now, she claimed it was a Native American ritual to help ferry the animal's spirit into the next life, or something along those lines. She was a nice enough woman, but obviously a bit eccentric. That being said, she seemed sincere and a little more than creeped out when she told us her story. Another masseuse that Z was close to at the spa, I'll call her M, arrived at work one day in the middle of the week in a haggard state. M was a young woman in her early 30s. She was friendly, and most of the time she had a bubbly personality. But on that day, she was aloof, downcast, and had bags under her eyes. Z noticed this the moment she walked in the door, but with work to do, she waited for a better time to ask M if everything was okay. When lunch came around, Zaz approached her friend and asked what was wrong. M brushed it off initially, saying that nothing was wrong, that she was simply tired, but Z persisted. M began to tear up then and started to sob. Z embraced her and told her it was going to be all right, that she could share what was on her mind if she needed to. M's sobs subsided a little, and she began to speak, but then stopped. What she had to say, she told Z, was too crazy, and Z would never believe her. Zed told M that she'd be surprised at what she may or may not find believable. So M composed herself a bit, and then began her story. M, her husband, and young son lived in a house about 20 miles outside of town. The house and the property were beautiful, essentially the couple's dream home. It included plenty of acreage nestled in a valley in the Ozark Mountains, and the house had a huge picture window in the living room, overlooking the valley and the forested mountains beyond. The night before, she'd awakened around 3 o'clock a.m. Something had startled her awake. No nightmares, no having to pee, but something had definitely awakened her. Something that she wasn't aware of just yet. She lay in bed in the dark for a while, listening in the silence, trying to go back to sleep, but she couldn't. She then carefully rolled out of the bed, trying not to wake her husband, and then she made her way through the dark house to the kitchen for a snack. As she walked through the lightless living room, she looked out of the picture window and froze. There was something standing on the deck just outside, a small silhouette outlined in starlight. She studied the shape in wide-eyed fear as it stood motionless on the deck overlooking the valley. It seemed to be looking up. Her shock turned to concern and confusion when she realized what the figure was. It was her 8-year-old son. She quickly flung the sliding door to the deck open and wrapped the boy in her arms, asking, "Are you okay, honey? What's wrong? What are you doing out here?" I'm looking at the lights," he said. Then he pointed out into the clear night sky. She followed the direction of his finger and saw several orbs of soft red, blue, and orange lights hovering over the valley. They were like bright stars at first, but then they moved slowly, deliberately into a formation. First a line, and then a cross, and then a diamond, and finally something that resembled the Big Dipper. There was nothing natural about their movement. They could not be shooting stars or aircraft. They weren't moving like that. It was like they were some sort of signal, almost as if they were communicating with something or someone. Her son tugged on the hem of her nightshirt and said that he was cold. She broke her trance and took her son quickly by the shoulder, leading him inside impatiently. She slid the door closed behind her and locked it, doing her best not to look back out over the valley. She closed the blinds on the big window in the living room and ushered her son into her bedroom to sleep with her and her husband, with the lights on. M stopped talking and looked up at Z, who looked back at her with eyes widened in amazement. She began to sob again. "Do you want to hear the really crazy part? The reason why this is so scary?" Z's mouth hung open as she thought about how to respond. Before she could reply, M continued. Her father was a physicist who'd worked at a government lab in New Mexico. He was never able to tell her what exactly he did for reasons of national security, so to say. While working in the Southwest, he'd fallen in love with the region's harsh but beautiful mountains and desert landscapes. After divorcing M's mother and retiring early with a handsome government pension, he bought a small ranch in Arizona. In the summertime, M, then a young girl, would stay with her father at his ranch. It was a very remote property, part of its allure for him. It was in the foothills of some mountains in the desert, but it had access to a water source, and there was a small pond back behind the ranch house, overgrown with tall cattails. Early in the afternoon one summer day, M's father left the ranch to run some errands in the nearest town. It was a brutally hot day, and M did not want to ride in the stifling hot truck, so she begged her father to let her stay so she could swim in the pond. Reluctantly, he agreed. Once her father had left, M put on her bathing suit and made her way down a small path of hot rocks and sand to the pond behind the house. The sky was almost impossibly blue in the clear, torturous Arizona summer heat. A slight breeze rustled the reeds and scrub brush, but it was otherwise silent, as if all the animal life had perished or gone underground to escape the relentless desert heat. As M rounded the bank of cattails that obscured the pond from the house, she froze at an unexpected encounter. 3 tall beings were standing on the opposite side of the pond. They were all identical and stood facing her as she came into view, as if they'd been waiting for her. M couldn't move. Whether that was from pure fear or something else, she couldn't tell. All she could do was stare in horror and disbelief at these things. They stood about 7 feet tall, each one completely indistinguishable from the other, as if they were clones or triplets or mirrored images of each other. They were vaguely humanoid, 2 unusually long and skinny arms that ended in spindly hands with long fingers, 2 long and thin legs, slender, elongated torsos, and skinnier necks. Their heads were long but proportional to the height and build of these things, whatever they were. They had ruddy, tan, and completely hairless skin, and wore what seemed to be blue, skin-tight jumpsuits. But the strangest and most awful aspect of these things were their faces. They were completely featureless, save for the eyes. No mouth, no ears, no nose. Just two somehow human-looking, but somehow not human-looking, eyes set into the blank, tanned plane of their faces, staring dispassionately and motionlessly at M. She blinked once, and soon found herself lying on the floor of her father's living room, right on her back. She was wrapped in the towel she'd taken with her to the pond, as if she'd been swaddled in it. The sun had gotten significantly lower in the sky. She could tell by the way it slanted in through the yellow blinds of the windows at a long angle. She sat up, confused, and beginning to panic. She heard the ticking of the old grandfather clock and looked over at it. The time read 5 p.m. She'd somehow lost nearly 3 hours of time. How? How's that possible? How had she even gotten back to the house? Just as strangely, she was completely dry. Not a bead of sweat had gathered on her, even though her father's house lacked air conditioning and was sickly hot. Her father arrived not long afterward, pulling his truck down the long driveway of the ranch. When he entered the house with his sack of groceries, he found Em in a state of distress. She told him in a panicked frenzy what she'd seen, what had happened to her at the pond, how she'd somehow lost 3 hours of her life. The old physicist stared coldly into the distance, waiting for his daughter to finish the story, then told her, "But they told me they'd leave you alone." Em was shaking and began to cry again. Z held her, and she buried her face in Z's arms. "That's why I'm afraid," she said. "I'm afraid that they came back for my son. I'm afraid that they came back for my son."